So welcome everyone. I'm Jeffrey Smith, and I direct the Center for Business Ethics at Seattle University in the Albers School of Business and Economics. I also hold the Frank Schranz Chair in Professional Ethics in the Albers School. And I want to welcome everyone to attending this event. I know we're all zoomed out on all sorts of fronts, but it's good to see a good number of people here. This event, Our Responsibilities in the Age of Social Media, was originally scheduled as a keynote event last spring as part of Albers Ethics Week. And we, of course, thought that if we moved it to the fall, we, of course, would take care of any lack of in-person meeting. And we, of course, now are still in a virtual environment. So we're holding it here today virtually. And I want to thank everyone for coming. And of course, it arguably is more timely now than it was even back in the spring. We thought with the election coming up and with the rise of social media and the role of social media and sort of filtering and being the de facto gatekeeper for our news, that it was an important topic for us to address. But since the pandemic and since the rise of election interference, and since we now have a pretty contested 2020 election, it's even more important than ever to sort of engage these questions about where responsibilities rest when it comes to understanding the most important information that's important to our lives and the lives of those around us. And before I introduce our featured speaker today, which as has already been noted, will be a very interactive kind of presentation, I want to introduce first someone you've already met initially, and that is Brooke Carlisle, who's the Frank Schranz Scholar and Graduate Assistant of the Center for Business Ethics. She will be moderating the Q&A session of this format after our guest speaks. This was conceived of as an event that was originally designed to be an event for the university community where we could all learn about strategies for addressing and dealing with the flow of misinformation and disinformation that we're quite frequently bombarded with. Brooke played an instrumental role in working to get this program off the ground. And so I want to thank her publicly. And I also want to note that she's one of our PMBA students in the Albers School, and before that, before she joined us at Seattle University, she was a student at the University of Montana, where she majored in biology and dance. And she will turn things over, or when the speaker is done, we'll turn things over to Brooke to sort of field the questions that you all are going to have. Brooke, is there any more instructions about the question and answer process?
Yeah, so we're going to be using the chat feature for our questions. For those on YouTube, go ahead and just drop them in the comments. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and write them in the chat. We'll see if they kind of get answered later in the presentation. And if not, I'll go ahead and ask those at the end. And then, of course, at the end, if you have any more questions, feel free to type that out. So just to get started, let's go ahead and everyone drop in the chat where you're calling in from. Personally, I'm from Tacoma, so I'm going to open that chat bar and write Tacoma, Washington. So go ahead and do that just so we all are familiar with that chat feature.
Great. Thanks, Brooke. And without further ado, I want to now introduce our guest. Felipe Anaya is our Associate Librarian and Coordinator of Service Design and Assessment at the Lemieux Library in McGoldrick Learning Commons. Many of you probably have interacted with Felipe on a number of different levels. He's the liaison to the Albers School of Business and Economics and the Arts and Leadership and Organizational Leadership programs. In addition to his MBA, he holds a master's degree in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois. And before his time at Seattle University, he was a librarian at New Mexico State University. In today's timely presentation, Felipe will discuss the importance and process of identifying reliable news and information sources and walk us through how to quickly fact-check news and provide tips on what to do and when we come across seemingly false or misleading online information. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Felipe.
Great, thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me on this timely conversation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. We have a few slides to share with you. And today we're just going to spend some time talking about misinformation, disinformation, and then have a series of activities to look through how we can evaluate the information that we come across, that we find online. So on December 4th, 2016, there's a man that walks into Comet Ping Pong carrying an assault rifle. He's there investigating these claims that the pizzeria had been the site of a child sex ring with associations to then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. No one is harmed in this interaction. He does get a few shots off before being arrested. This person was not affiliated with the alt-right. He claimed that he was not political in any way or even voted for Donald Trump. Instead, he had just read some articles online and listened to Alex Jones of InfoWars, who promoted this theory. And that theory was known as Pizzagate. During the 2016 election, there were a number of conspiracy theories from organizations like 4chan and other extremist groups on Twitter and Facebook, claiming that Hillary Clinton was part of these child sex rings and satanic rituals. These claims were posted on a number of sites that designed to look like mainstream news websites, and then shared with hundreds of thousands of people on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms. So as we all know, the 2016 presidential election featured this proliferation of misinformation and disinformation campaigns. While misinformation had existed prior to this, social media provided a new way to misinform and mislead people. Another example that we might be aware of is from the Robert Mueller investigations. Part of the investigation revealed the impact of the Internet Research Agency, which was this shadowy Russian company linked to the Kremlin. During the previous presidential election, Russian efforts reached 126 million people on Facebook in the United States. They sent out hundreds of thousands of tweets and uploaded over 1,000 videos to YouTube. All of this disinformation was designed to sow discord in the US presidential elections. At the same time, we know that there's an increasing consumption of news from individuals from social media platforms. On this slide here, you're seeing some results from a Pew Research study that was done last year. And so in 2019, they found that 55% of US adults either received their news from social media sometimes or often. And this was up 10% as compared to 2016. This growth in news consumption from social media, along with the increase of misinformation online, has some pretty serious consequences for public health, our elections, our social movements, amongst other different subjects. So the very first post that you see here, this is from Facebook, sharing a link to a documentary called The Plandemic. In this video, Dr. Judy Mikovits describes these unsubstantiated secret plots by global elites like Bill Gates and Dr. Anthony Fauci to use the coronavirus pandemic to profit and grab political power. While the video has been removed, it was watched over 8 million times on different social media platforms. It was just part of this effort to build mistrust in our public health officials and building mistrust in their guidance to combat the pandemic. So misinformation about the coronavirus has grown to such an extent that the World Health Organization has called it an infodemic. So put simply, that there is just so much information about the coronavirus that we just don't really know what to believe anymore. And so this has a result to change offline behaviors that just might cause more harm, like people not wearing masks. And the second post that we see up here in the top right-hand corner, this is someone sharing images from the conservative website called The Blaze, in which, according to them, there were thousands of completed mail-in ballots that were found in a California dumpster. However, the photos are actually showing empty envelopes that were from the 2018 November election, and this was according to the Sonoma County officials. In fact, when this tweet was posted, the ballots for this year's elections haven't even been mailed out yet to people. So there's been a lot of false and unsubstantiated claims about mail-in ballots this year, and that's all designed to undermine the public trust in our systems and the election. It's really undermining our democratic systems. And in the bottom right-hand corner, this last post is a post that we see from Washington, D.C. And it is in regards to this hashtag called DC Blackout. And it was started by an account that only had 3 Twitter followers. And from this single account, it generated 500,000 tweets in the first 9 hours of being created. Many of these posts claim that authorities had blocked protesters from communicating with their smartphones in order to crack down on unrest. They also featured a bunch of images that showed different rioters and looters that weren't actually part of this protest or any other recent protest. People were promoting this hashtag as a way to distract the public from the actual claims of the protesters. We have seen other examples of misinformation surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement, claims about Antifa, which has galvanized armed groups of white vigilantes to appear in different communities. And so this is all to say that we have seen some really substantial impacts of misinformation that is being proliferated through these social media platforms. And so given the impacts of misinformation, we do have a personal responsibility not to share false information with our friends, with our family, or community. Hitting that share button might feel like it's just barely causing a ripple in the grand scheme of things. However, if we all do it, that small ripple becomes a tidal wave. So without meaning to, we can inadvertently cause harm, we can cause panic, just worry amongst people. So what do we do to determine whether something is true or false before sharing the tweet? And so that brings us to the next part of the session, which is how do we evaluate the information that we find online? And so the first thing that we need to kind of understand before we jump into that is just the different types of misinformation, disinformation, and what this all means. This very first graphic is from First Draft. It's an organization that helps journalists kind of identify misinformation, disinformation. And so they kind of have this information disorder framework. So they list misinformation as unintentional mistakes, such as inaccurate photo captions, dates, statistics, and so forth, that generally people don't realize this information is false or misleading. Disinformation includes information that was fabricated or deliberately manipulated audio or visual content. It's when people intentionally create false or misleading information, either to make money, have some sort of like political influence, or maliciously cause harm or trouble. And then malinformation is something we don't see quite as often when we talk about misinformation, disinformation. And this is just referring to when people are using genuine information to cause harm amongst people. And that might be leaking out emails to damage someone's reputation. So today we're going to focus more on the misinformation and disinformation that we come across. Kind of missing from this graphic is you might be wondering, what about fake news? That's a term that's been widely used to describe this type of information disorder. However, it's not really specific, first of all. Same fake news isn't actually fake, it's just information that's misleading or taken out of context. There's also memes and videos and other social media posts that just aren't news at all, and so this fake news label doesn't really apply. It's also a term that's been weaponized by politicians to kind of dismiss news outlets that they don't agree with. No doubt have you heard references to the fake news media. And it's not just being done in our country, it's happening in foreign countries as well, in efforts to discredit news agencies. And so for that reason, there's just been this general movement to step away from using this term and calling things for what they are, whether that's misinformation, that's outright lies, rumors, or conspiracy theories. So kind of with that understanding, the framework of misinformation, disinformation, we can start to evaluate what we find online, and that starts with emotional skepticism. Anytime you come across anything online, it's healthy to read it with a little bit of skepticism. Much of what we share is kind of based on emotion. A lot of the social media posts that we come across are just preying on emotions that we have, whether that's anger or something that's making us happy or scared or laugh. And so when we find that information's kind of preying on those emotions, we tend to be a little bit more biased, especially when that information is confirming some of our existing views. Something doesn't have to be true in order to feel like it might be true. And so if it has that potentiality that it is true, we're more likely to share that information with someone else. So just think back in terms of the last thing you might have shared on social media. How do you think the person who created that post was trying to make you feel? Did you share it based on your emotion? Was it something that made you angry, and so you thought, oh, I want my other followers to see this post as well because it's very concerning? So when we say, lead with this emotional skepticism, it's just to take a moment to pause and consider whether or not consider your emotional reactions first before you start to share that information. So there are multiple methods to evaluating different claims, and there's a lot of similarities between them. Today, we're going to go over an approach that comes from Mike Caulfield. He's an information literacy expert from from Washington State University down in Vancouver. So he's relatively local. He's also the author of a book called The Web Literacy for Student Fact Checkers. His method, it's called 4 Moves and a Habit. And the habit's actually to check your emotions, which is what we kind of mentioned on the previous slide. I like to lead in with the habit just because it forces me to think, should I take a pause right now because something is causing this emotional response? And then if it is, maybe I should start to go through these techniques to evaluate a claim. So the 4 moves are: check for previous work, go upstream to the source, read laterally, and then circle back. So we're going to go through an example of each one of these. We're going to have some short activities associated with them. I'll be posting links in the chat for you to follow along. And as we're doing this, you're welcome to ask questions as we go through some of this. So the first movement that we're going to look at is checking for previous work. So when you're fact checking a claim or quote in an article or something, the simplest thing you can do is to see if someone's already done that work for you. A lot of us are familiar with the fact-checking organizations like Snopes, PolitiFact, factcheck.org. These are really helpful for determining whether something is true, misleading, or an outright lie. And so what we have here next is an example of a claim from a couple of months ago about net gaiters. There were these numbers of headlines indicating that net gaiters, when used as masks against the coronavirus, that they could be worse than having no mask at all. So we have some of these headlines from Forbes. They said net gaiters do not curb COVID-19, city finds. CBS News says net gaiters may be worse than not wearing a mask at all, city shows. So each one of these comes from a reputable news agency, and all the headlines tell us that it comes from either a study or researcher. So I'm curious, how many of you heard this claim and believed the headlines, or heard the claim and didn't believe it, or didn't hear the claim at all? And so feel free to enter your responses into the chat. Don't be shy about sharing. Just know that, like, when I read this story, when this information first came out, I thought it was true. I thought, I shouldn't be wearing this neck gaiter that I had been wearing in the past because, this study is saying like it's worse than wearing no mask at all. There's also this brief period of time where I go hiking a lot, and I definitely had a few judgy thoughts of people going by with their neck gaiters thinking like, oh, did you read the study about neck gaiters and how they're not very effective? So kind of looking at the chat, some people heard it and didn't believe it. Other people weren't entirely sure if it was true. Some people did believe it. Some people hadn't heard this at all. So I want everybody to take a quick moment to see if you can find some information about this claim through one of these fact-checking websites. So I'll give everybody a quick moment to do that, and then we'll come back and kind of discuss what we found. So if you found some information about this particular claim, go ahead and post in the chat what you found. So someone is saying that Snopes says it's false. Yeah, so this is a relatively easy one. If we go to Snopes, and I'll go ahead and share a web browser. Sorry, I have multiple pages here. It's a little difficult. All right. So if we were to look up this claim online, I typed in NetGator twice. I meant to type in fact check. So something simple that you can do is just search for NetGator's coronavirus fact checking. Our very first result up here at the top is from Snopes. It says in our claim, if we scroll down, that it's a false. That the news agencies, and we can look at the description here, was looking at the research and misreporting the research that was being done. In fact, what the research found was that it was just an attempt to show how we can measure the efficacy of different masks. It wasn't intended to actually measure the efficacy of certain masks like NetGator's, that there needed to be additional research in order to verify whether or not NetGator's were effective at being masks and stopping the coronavirus from being spread. And so this was not an intentional part of the news agencies in order to mislead people. They had just read the study and come to a different, were just misreporting the information that they found. What's really interesting is that if you go back to some of the examples that we were looking at in terms of the headlines, that many of them kind of didn't issue any sort of updates or clarification about this information. The only one that came close was the Washington Post. And let me see if I have that one up here. And so on the Washington Post, for their original reporting, they have this update that says, since the story ran, more research has been done on gator efficacy. You can read about the new studies by aerosol scientists who have pushed back against the characterization that thin gators may be worse than nothing. What's really interesting is that it's just talking about the same study. It's not new studies. And so they're not completely saying like, oh, we weren't misreporting this information. It was just, here's an update and here's some additional comments by the researchers who did this particular study. So that is the first move of checking for previous work. And yes, they were underreporting that information. So the next, let's see, go back to our PowerPoint here. The next move that we have to discuss and look at is going upstream to the source. Sometimes when we read a news story or come across something that's posted on social media, they're oftentimes quoting someone else, linking to some other source, or providing an image. So going upstream just means to go up to that original source of information and to evaluate it. So here we have, once again, that NetGator example. So in all the news stories, they actually did provide links to the original research study that we see here. So if it was a case that fact-checking websites didn't actually take a moment to look at this particular claim, maybe what you found was the story was reported, and so you went out to see if someone had done the previous work, find out that no one had done yet, you could actually go upstream and start to read the original article. So by reading the original article, you might have come to a different conclusion that was reported by the news, and recognize that newspapers were underreporting some of the findings, and kind of just honing in on that one particular piece about NetGators. So always see if you can find the original. Sometimes there'll be links and sometimes there's not. And when you don't see any links, that's when you should be extra skeptical of the information that you're coming across. Now, while links are great and additional research is wonderful, sometimes you come into situations where what you're finding is photos or videos. So what we have here is a Facebook post that's showing images of the destruction from different Portland protests. It goes so far as to say that rioters have barricaded buildings closed and set them on fire with people inside. It has 960 shares, and then when we consider like how many people then repost this and share it in a different way, you know, this could have had significant number of shares that kind of have rippled across the internet. So there are different tools that we can use to determine whether a photo is being used out of context. Because in this particular situation, they're not linking to anything. They're just providing us with images. And so what we can use is Google Images or a resource called 10i to do a reverse image search. So I'm going to show you an example of what a reverse image search looks like with an image. So I'm going to switch back to a browser. Oops. Sorry, I got. All right, so we're going to take a look back at, this was just another article that I had found online about NetGators. They have an image, and so just wanted to first point out how you can do a reverse image search on an image. So the first thing that you need to do is right-click on the image itself, and you'll see some different options. You could either save the image to downloads and then upload that image into one of these programs in order to do a reverse image search, or you can copy the image address. So I'm just going to copy that address, and I'm going to search for Google Images. So with Google Images, you'll see that next to the search box, there's this little search by image icon. And when you click on this, it gives you a couple options. You could either paste an image URL, or you can upload an image from your computer. So by pasting the URL that we got from that NPR website, we get a number of results. One is it's searching for the image along with some keywords that might be associated with that image. That's NetGator and COVID. We have that particular specific image that we search for along with some related images that are similar. And then we include some pages that have that matching image. And so we see that this particular image was used across a number of websites to talk about NetGators and how they were not effective in curbing COVID-19. As we look at the dates, NPR used this image August 14th. We see that there was an earlier date of August 11th. So this is one way to kind of do this reverse image search to see whether an image has been used somewhere else. So going back and using our Portland protest example, I downloaded the image. It's on my computer. And so I'm going to upload the image of the protests to see if what they're trying to represent from this protest is misleading or true. So I've uploaded one of the images. And so we have the image at the top. The keyword that it's assigned is scrap. We can see some additional images. And then down here below, we see which pages have used this image in the past. And so by clicking on some of these links, it talks about an arsonist. If we scroll on this page, we see that this is one of the places where this image was used, saying that dozens of cars were destroyed in a 4-alarm fire in Northeast Portland in August 26th, 2019. So this certainly wasn't associated with a protest that recently happened. Instead, somebody just went online and found some images. So that's how you do a reverse image search. One of the frustrating things about Google Images is you can't sort by date, because the best thing to do would just be to find the most recent, the oldest time that an image was used. So I'm going to give you a quick example that you can try out in terms of this other image that was used. So in the chat, I'm going to post a URL link so you can see what the reversed image search looks like. And there you go. So if you want to give that a quick try, and let us know where this image might have been taken from. Yeah, so a couple people put in the chat that this was from a bagel shop explosion in 2016, and that's correct. So once you do the reverse image search, you quickly find the news story about that particular explosion. So that is one way that people use images to kind of mislead people in these social media posts. And one way that you can use this reverse image search to go upstream to see whether or not that image is true and how they used it, or if it was taken out of context. So we're going to go back to our presentation. So the next thing that we have here are videos. So in the very first image is a social media post from a Trump campaign advisor, Katrina Pearson, in 2019 of last year. So in this tweet, she's claiming that all these rockets are being set off from Gaza into Israel, asking people to condemn these actions. Well, it turns out the video that she used wasn't actually from where she said it was. Instead, it was from Belarus, which was over 2,000 miles away and was taken in 2014. The Washington Post did some fact checking about this particular claim, and that's what you see in the middle, kind of describing their process for fact checking this. On the far right-hand side is the original video that was posted on YouTube back in 2014. While there's some really straightforward techniques for verifying images, videos are a little bit more challenging. To fact check this claim, what the Washington Post did was they did a reverse image search, by taking a screenshot of part of the video. And so with that screenshot and doing the reverse image search, they're able to learn that the video had been widely circulated across the internet to represent different conflicts, whether the conflict was in Iraq, Ukraine, or Russia. So once they learned that, then through watching the video and seeing one of the posts, they found out that the video was showing something called a BM-21 grad. And so they did some additional searching for this particular weapon system. And so they found other videos from Belarus's military TV showing the same exercise on the same day, but from a different angle. So they're able to verify the location of the particular video. Then what they also did was look at some photographs from different news agencies about this particular place to sort of double check the location of this place. So it was a lot of work that the Washington Post did in order to verify, was this video being used out of context, and then to verify the location. So there's some really advanced techniques to look at verifying videos that we don't have time to go through today. So I'll just say, you want to take extra precautions whenever you come across a video, and then be extra skeptical before sharing them. The next thing that we have is, the next move is reading laterally. And for this one, we're just going to jump straight into the exercise. And so I want everybody to take a moment to evaluate this website. It's called minimumwage.com. And I'm going to post a link to the chat. And so take a moment, look at this site, and give us some thoughts and some feedbacks. I'll give everybody just about a couple minutes, or 2 to 3 minutes, to look at this website. And you're welcome to use whatever resources you'd like. I'll give everybody just another minute, and then we'll take a look at this particular website. So if anybody has any other comments to add. Somebody found a New York Times article. Someone's talking about the Employment Policies Institute. There's this couple of quotes from, I think that's probably the Wikipedia article about the particular website or the organization that I've seen before. So we're going to go ahead and stop there. I know I didn't give you a lot of time to evaluate this claim, but what we find is this is an example that was used by the Stanford University History Group in order to determine how well different groups fact check claims or evaluate information, I should say. And so in their study, what they did was that they had 3 groups of people. They had students, they had historians, professors of history, and they also had professional fact checkers. And they asked each one of these groups to look at this particular website and evaluate the information that they find. And so what they found was that professional fact checkers, all of them found out the connection between this minimumwage.com website, along with a company called Berman and Company that's based in Washington, D.C. And this Berman and Company based in Washington, D.C. is a public relations firm that lobbies on the behalf of restaurants and hotel industries. According to the New York Times, and I think that's probably the one that was posted in the chat, this particular organization is this official sounding nonprofit group that's disseminating information on behalf of corporate clients. So there's a very clear bias surrounding this. So fact checkers were able to quickly hone in on this. It took them about 205 seconds. For professors of history, only 6 in 10 were able to find that connection. It took them twice as long in order to find this. And then for students, only 40% of students were able to make this connection. And for those who did, it took them about 7 minutes. So this was kind of the approach that professional fact checkers make, is that they look at the site and they immediately jump off the website. They use something that we call, what the Stanford researchers refer to as lateral reading. Rather than staying on a particular page, they start to open up all these other tabs to look at information. So they spent only a few seconds on the minimum wage website. They looked at the About page. They saw that there was a connection between these Employment Policies Institute. They went to that site. They looked at that About page. They weren't quite sure about this organization, so they started to look for additional information, finding the source watch, and then finding an NPR article. So they're quite fast and efficient at evaluating information through this use of lateral reading. Students, on the other hand, oftentimes just stayed on the page. That's something that students are often taught to do in school, and something that I kind of recognize whenever I work with students in evaluating information. Oftentimes they just stay on the source, and that's called vertical reading. They might just look at the About page. They might see, oh, this is from a .org organization, and so they sort of just look at the features of the website. So lateral reading is just about jumping off from a particular source to see what are other people saying about the source that you're looking at. I use this technique a lot. Sometimes I get messages from faculty that look like this. This one is just a journal solicitation asking a faculty member to publish their research in their journal. And so sometimes they're asking, is this a reputable journal that I should be publishing in? And so when you do a little bit of work, a little bit of lateral reading, Wikipedia is a good place to go if you're trying to do some lateral reading. You see that this organization is a predatory publisher. And so this is one where faculty should stay away from. So that's the lateral reading technique. It's kind of similar to the other two. You're sort of not fixated on the source, you're just moving on to other sources of information. So the last move is called circle back. And that's just essentially if you get stuck when you're looking at some sources of information, go ahead and try just a different approach to evaluating that information. And so the last activity that we have is this particular claim. based on the interest of time, I'm just going to post this claim on the chat, and you're welcome to look up this or evaluate this claim on your own. There's some different approaches that you can take into evaluating this, but here is the original tweet. You'll notice in this tweet that they included an image as well as a URL to another organization. So that is the 4 moves. There's some additional methods that are out there for evaluating claims. One that sometimes we use in the library is called the CRAP test. It stands for currency, relevancy, accuracy, authority, and purpose. It's kind of this series of questions to ask surrounding each one of these areas. So for example, with authority, what are the author's credentials? What is the publication? Is there contact information that I can follow up with? It takes a while to go through the CRAP test. And so with social media, using this 4 moves is appropriate, but sometimes you just need extra ways to evaluate information. And that's where this comes in. The SIFT is also by Caulfield, who developed the 4 moves. It's just a different framing of these 4 moves. So stop is the check your emotions, investigate the source, is going upstream, finding coverage, is finding, is checking on previous work, and then the tracing claims is the reading laterally. Another good source that you might want to look at in terms of evaluating data comes from a couple of folks up at the University of Washington. They put together this class called Calling Bullshit. And in this class, they teach students how to evaluate the data that they find online. A lot of times data can be misrepresenting information or being misleading. Down here is an example where there's some data that's coming out about the number of hours that people work in different countries. It makes it seem like Germans work a lot more than people who work in France, but it's just because of the way that they started the x-axis with the data, not at 0. So if you start the data at 0, your x-axis, what you find is that they're all kind of similar to each other. So it's just misrepresenting the data in a different way. So they have a class where they've posted all of the information about their class online. They also just wrote a book that we'll have at the library pretty soon. And one of the people who put together this book and the class is Jevin West. And he is one of the speakers at the upcoming session on Thursday evening, talking about social media platforms and misinformation and their obligations. Just wanted to show you some of the work in terms of, this is by ProPublica Illinois, and some of the work that they do in terms of fact checking. It just goes to show that depending on the use of information will determine how thorough you want to be in evaluating that information. So what you just see here is that in a 4,000 word story, this particular journalist had 291 facts that they had to check. They had a spreadsheet and how they organized all their fact checking. And so while the 4 moves can be helpful in just evaluating social media, just keep in mind that you want to take some extra precautions depending on the use of that information. So if you are writing an investigative piece, or if you're a student writing a research paper, go beyond those 4 moves and look at some other evaluation techniques. So future challenges, just real quick, what can people tell me about this particular image? What do you notice? And feel free to post in the chat. They all seem happy. Do they have the same nose or portraits? Well, it turns out that none of the people in these pictures exist. They are not pictures of actual people. There are new technologies that are creating synthetic media using things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. So in this particular case, there is 2 machine learning programs. One is called a discriminator. The other one is called a generator. So what the job of the discriminator is to determine whether or not an image is real or not. So you feed a bunch of real images in order to teach the discriminator. And then the job of the generator is to create fake images to try to fool the discriminator. And so you pit these two machine learning programs against each other until you can fool the discriminator, and then you have a successful image that you can just share online. So machine learning is one way of creating new synthetic media. Another is artificial intelligence in creating deep fakes. You might have heard of deep fakes before. This is an example with creating a video with Mark Zuckerberg where it wasn't him. They just took another video and they were able to mimic his voice and mannerisms in order to create a deep fake where he talks about how he likes to steal everyone's information. So those are some future challenges in terms of social media. There's not a really great ways to evaluate those at that time. There is some responsibility, I think, with social media platforms, and some of that will be talked about this coming presentation on Thursday evening with social media and social responsibility. So you're more than welcome to attend that session, encourage you. And so with that, that's it that I have today. And so I just want to pass it along to Brooke to see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very informative. I had no idea about the image search, so I'm pretty excited to try that out. I did drop the link for the registration for the October 8th event at 5:30 p.m. if anyone's interested in learning more. And this will be kind of a broader conversation about social media and who's responsible for what and that sort of thing. So if anyone does have any specific questions, go ahead and drop it in the chat. If you're on YouTube, go ahead and comment and we'll try to get to those. To start off, I had a question. So the Gator article really got me because I tend to trust, especially Forbes was on my trusted list. So websites like Washington Post, Forbes, and USA Today seem trustworthy, but were misleading about the Gator headlines. So how do we know that we can trust our sources that we pick, and how do we know that Snopes and PolitiFact remained unbiased?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. I think in terms of trusted sources, it's always good to identify some sources that you regularly trust. But then when it becomes a time where you're either sharing information, or if you're using that information for like writing a research paper or something else, that's when, even with your trusted sources, you might take a moment to, if they're posting results of a research study, to go upstream to that original source to make sure that how they're reporting that information isn't taken out of context or misrepresenting it in some way. So if you're just reading your trusted news sources to get some information, that's fine. But once you start to use that information for something, then just take that extra step. In terms of the fact-checking websites, a lot of them are really good in terms of listing out their own sources of how they evaluated that specific claim. And so if you're curious about whether or not they have evaluated that claim appropriately, you can actually follow up through those sources and maybe see if you can find some additional sources of information that corroborate what they posted. Sometimes multiple fact-checking websites will post about a very similar claim.
Awesome. A little bit on that same front, we have a question about how reliable is Wikipedia?
Wikipedia. So with students, oftentimes I tell folks is use Wikipedia as a way to find additional information. So in Wikipedia, they're oftentimes listing different sources. And so you can use those listed sources to find reliable sources of information. So don't really count on Wikipedia as a source, a credible source. Instead, look at the sources that they're using in order to draft these articles, and then determine whether or not those are credible. And if they are, then cite those instead.
Awesome. There was a question about getting a copy of the slides, and this whole presentation will be reposted on our Facebook and social media page. You can also email us and we can get you a copy of that once it's ready. So no worries there. there was, in that question, it was the 3 fact-checking websites was Snopes, PolitiFact, and what was the third one?
The third one was factcheck.org, and that one is from, I believe, the Annenberg School of Policy down in Southern California.
Great.
And then someone also asked about the second image checker. It's called Tenai. I just posted the name of that particular image checker in the chat. It doesn't work as well as Google Images, but I think it does provide that ability to organize images by date. And so that's one. Depending on the image, you might want to try other foreign search engines as well, especially if it's an image that was taken from probably a foreign country.
Cool. Our next question is, in your opinion, should governments have the authority to shut down social media platforms?
Oh, that's a really big question. I don't know if I have the answer to that. I think that would be if you attend the session on Thursday evening, I would pose it to them about the social media platforms. I think there are benefits to social media in having us stay connected, especially during this time when we're all physically distancing from one another, but there are certainly some obligations that I think social media platforms have in terms of protecting the truth and not posting things and sharing things that might be misleading and cause harm with people. And I think they've taken some of those steps. I've noticed when I was trying to find examples, there are many instances where social media had already tagged something as being false, or if they've taken down that particular instance.
Awesome. This is a little bit in line with some of the other questions, but once we do this verifying and lateral reading several times, is it okay to choose our trusted source and stick with them? I know you said that it's really when we're sharing the content that we need to be extra careful. Is that right?
Yeah, when we're sharing our content, taking that little extra step. Yeah, or any time that there's something that just builds up like a strong emotional response, like just taking a pause and think, okay, it's from my trusted source, but I just really want to make sure because it might be feeding towards some other biases that I might already have.
Excellent. So we are at 1:30. I am reading some of the comments on YouTube, so we will get to those, but I just wanted to thank everyone for joining today. And like I said, this will be posted. If you have any more questions, go ahead and stay on. We'll stay on just a little bit longer to get all of those answered. But thank you guys so much again.
Thank you, everyone.